I'd like to begin by acknowledging we're on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. And of course, we're privileged to have our press conference in their territory. I'm going to turn it over to Deanna Juricevich, who is the chair of the BC Human Rights Tribunal, to begin. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to give all of you a very warm welcome here this morning. I want to thank you to our Union of BC Indian Chiefs for welcoming us into your home. Grand Chief Stuart Phillip. I know that we had Chief Don Tom and Chief Judy Wilson here earlier this morning, and I know that they had to leave, but I want to honor them as well. As Andrea mentioned, my name is Deanna Juricevich. I'm the chair of the BC Human Rights Tribunal. Thank you for joining us as we embark on this journey to improve access to justice in our province. Before I turn the floor over to Ardith, I wanted to share with you a little bit about how we got here. So this journey began with silence. Indigenous peoples were not filing human rights complaints, and our Human Rights Tribunal wanted to understand why and do something about it. Ardith reached into this silence and opened a door that allowed us to hear from over 100 Indigenous peoples about their experiences. I want to honor Ardith here this morning. I want to honor the voices that she honors in her report, and I want to honor the truth. Our Human Rights Tribunal hears you, and what you say matters. So this report is both a journey of renewal for our tribunal, and it's also a call to action. On that journey of renewal, I just want to pause here and acknowledge where we are. And I know that Louise Mandel is not yet in the room. I know she will be joining us. But our Union of BC Indian Chiefs, under the direction of the late Grand Chief George Manuel and leaders like Louise Mandel, had been embarking on this journey for over 3 decades. And they've been carrying a torch and shining a light on these issues. Like any great leader, Louise is also a mentor, and she has been inspiring others to carry that torch, like Ardith, to shine a light and steward these issues forward. So Louise has carried that torch, shined it as brightly as she can. She's passed it on to Ardith, who's shining it as brightly as she can. And together, all of us in this room can carry that torch forward together. So in addition to this being a journey of renewal, it's also a call to action. And Ardith report, and there's Louise coming in as we speak. Hi, Louise. I just wanted to say I was just honoring you and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs for your work that you've done for over 3 decades in carrying the torch and shining the light on these issues. So thank you. Thank you for joining us here this morning. So in addition to this being a journey of renewal, it's also a call to action. And Ardith's report is making 9 key recommendations for us to act. 5 of those are actions that our Human Rights Tribunal will do immediately. 4 of those require your help and require us to act together. And so we need your help to move forward, and your voices and wisdom are central to these efforts. So thank you for joining us on this journey. Let's take this next step together to transform the way in which we provide justice in our province. As with anything in life, we have to be resourceful. And so we are embracing the winter weather, and we've done what we can to make this happen here this morning. So I'm grateful that Ardith is able to join us over the phone. And Ardith, I'm now turning the floor over to you.
Hi there. I'm glad that I was able to join from Chilliwack, where I'm completely snowed in. And I want to thank Deanna and the BC Human Rights Tribunal for having the courage to commission this report. In the process of this report, we created a survey because we wanted feedback from Indigenous people, and we thought we would get something like 30 surveys. We thought that would be a high watermark. And we were very surprised when almost immediately, in very short order, Indigenous peoples got this survey and started distributing it to their friends, to other members of the community. And we had over 100 survey respondents. 78% of those people were First Nations, 15% Métis, 8% were Inuit, And one of the things that became very clear was that Indigenous peoples expressed an abiding sense of exclusion. They expressed the idea that in Canada and BC, discrimination against Indigenous peoples has become a way of life. And people said things like, we believe human rights are for other people, but not for us. And this is the very dire situation that the Expanding Our Vision report wants to address. And I know most recently there's been a lot of public press, for example, about the grandfather and granddaughter who were handcuffed when they tried to open a bank account at the BMO. And one of the things that I found very interesting is that when you speak to non-Indigenous peoples, there tends to be shock or outrage. But when you speak to Indigenous peoples, they tend more to respond with, oh, that happened to me, that happened to my brother or my cousin. Maybe not the handcuffed, but people have pervasive experiences of being ignored, being denied, as being treated as somehow as less than. And the survey that we did showed that over 60% of Indigenous peoples were unaware of the human rights process in BC. And of those that were aware, also over 60% said that they hadn't contemplated filing a report because they didn't think it would make any difference. And the recommendations in this report really highlight this key access to justice issue and the idea that we need to start making a difference. One of the grounds that we're suggesting is that Indigenous identity needs to be added to the BC Human Rights Code as a protected ground, because the discrimination that Indigenous peoples report experiencing isn't solely based on race. It's based on Indigenous identity, Indigenous difference. And this is something that Indigenous peoples were very clear that needs to happen, that human rights can't just be understood without reference to Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous laws, how Indigenous people see human rights, including how those human rights are tied to territory, tied to land. So I also, a couple of other areas that I think are really important to focus on in the report are that there is an entire lack of information, both within Indigenous communities, about the BC Human Rights Tribunal existence and the fact that it's possible to file human rights complaints, but also, I mentioned before this idea that racism is a way of life. We need to start educating publicly about what racism against Indigenous people looks like, because if we can't name it, we can't begin the process of eradicating it. And it's gone too long unnamed and unaddressed. At other areas, there's a real need to get a form of human rights legal aid to help Indigenous people start to bring these cases, because when we support Indigenous peoples to start standing up when their human rights are violated, we'll start to transform our reality, and that's a very necessary step. Those are the preliminary comments that I wanted to share.
Thank you, Ardith. We'll turn to Amber Prince.
Hi, I'm Amber Prince, and I'm a staff lawyer at Atira Women's Resource Society in Vancouver, and I've been providing legal advocacy to Indigenous women for the past 14 years at Atira, and we see the devastating consequences that discrimination has on Indigenous women and their children and families on a daily basis at Atira. We have seen Indigenous women discriminated against by businesses like BMO, for example, by police, by their service providers, by healthcare workers, by social workers, just to name a few. Ardith's report offers not just key insights that we all need to pay attention to, It also offers key recommendations to the Human Rights Tribunal, to government, and to service providers, and frankly, to all of us. This report affirms the voices and experiences of so many Indigenous people. As Ardith said, discrimination is often a way of life for Indigenous people. It is a systemic and epidemic discrimination that Indigenous people face often on a daily basis. Ardith's report is really a call to action to all of us to effectively respond to this discrimination, this profound discrimination that Indigenous peoples face and continue to endure. Kananas Komatin, Ardith, and to the Human Rights Tribunal. Ardith, thank you for your powerful work, your important work that you've done here on behalf of Indigenous peoples in really sharing what needs to happen and what is continuing to happen for Indigenous peoples, and providing the ways forward for all of us. And thank you to the Human Rights Tribunal for facilitating this process and also prioritizing this process, in spite of the fact that a piece of the report is a critique and commentary on how the tribunal and all of us can improve how we do things. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And we'll now turn to Kasari Govender, the BC Human Rights Commissioner.
Hello, and thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here to speak to this important report. Thank you to the people whose land we are on right now, to the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And thank you to the tribunal for this important piece of work that Ardith has written up so beautifully. As BC Human Rights Commissioner, I welcome the report. I think it makes an important contribution to the conversation about reform and transformation in the human rights system and access to justice in this context. We know that Indigenous people face significant human rights issues here in BC, and yet they are largely not accessing the Human Rights Tribunal system or the human rights system. And that's a disconnect that we need to all be paying attention to. The report looks squarely at some of these challenges. It looks at the challenges that Indigenous people face in accessing human rights resolutions in BC. And what it reveals is that Indigenous people carry an abiding sense of exclusion from the complaint process. Indigenous people report feeling that the discrimination and exclusion they face in their daily lives is replicated and reflected in the human rights system itself, in structures that do not reflect their collective rights or foundational beliefs, in the lack of access to lawyers to help them navigate complex and technical processes, and in the lack of representation of Indigenous people in tribunal staff and members. This has left many Indigenous people with the sense that filing a complaint is futile. Most poignantly, perhaps, is that many participants in this research said that the racism they feel, that they face, is so pervasive that they don't see how reporting it will make any difference in their lives. This report makes clear that, quote, there can be no true justice where Indigenous people feel that there is no recourse for violations of their basic human rights. And the report comes at a critical moment. The BC Human Rights Tribunal is undertaking this process of renewal amidst widespread calls for change in the relationship between Indigenous people and Canadian society. Change has been driven by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, by the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiries, also recommendations for change, and by BC's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So now is the time to make critical changes to human rights, to the human rights system in BC. And there are a number of key recommendations for systemic change that my office is looking forward to working on. The first is in relation to education. As the TRC did before it, this report recognizes that public education on human rights is critical to transforming relationships in society. This report recommends that education aimed at Indigenous peoples to ensure that they know their rights and remedies under the law is undertaken, as well as education aimed at the public to dismantle stereotypes and discrimination against Indigenous people. Human rights education is central to my mandate as Human Rights Commissioner, and we will be working to implement these important recommendations. Second, my office is committed to delving more deeply into the recommended changes to the Human Rights Code itself. We will be advocating for changes to the code to ensure that it is more accessible and indeed more effective for Indigenous peoples. And third, we look forward to joining with others to push for greater access to legal advice and representation before the tribunal from the moment of filing through to resolution. I want to commend the BC Human Rights Tribunal for commissioning a report that looks so critically at their own practices and structures so that they might adapt and better serve Indigenous peoples here in BC. And this is the kind of institutional leadership that will transform systems and structures that have for too long allowed for discrimination towards and marginalization of Indigenous peoples. I want to thank Ardith again for her hard work and to all the individuals who contributed to this report. I look forward to working on many of the issues that are raised here today. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, we'll hear from Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, the President of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs.
Why, Pisnaksil, Esquis Asiut. Simply, good day, my dear friends and relatives. My traditional name is Asiut. And I would like to say, as President of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, we would like to express our gratitude to Ardith Walkem for for bringing forward this issue and for developing such an eloquent and powerful statement on the need for dramatic change in today's society in regard to the rights and interests of Indigenous peoples. The history of this country is written on the backs of Indigenous people. Society at large and the country itself has failed miserably in rising above the frontier mentality and that particular narrative that Indigenous people are the servants of the colonizers and really of little value. And the discrimination and racism that we have suffered for hundreds of years continues within the context of so-called modern society. The racial profiling of the Bank of Montreal and the grandfather and his 12-year-old daughter or granddaughter, who was simply engaging in a rite of passage to open a bank account, was arrested and handcuffed and absolutely humiliated because of the racist attitudes of not only the Bank of Montreal, but also the Vancouver Police Department. And that's been normalized in our society. The fact that we have elders and knowledge keepers and spiritual people in Wet'suwet'en territory that are under threat of attack by paramilitary units of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is another prime example of the normalization of the way this country works in terms of Indigenous people versus the colonizer and the power structure of the colonizing governments. This country needs to rise above that. It needs to mature. It needs to know and understand that in this time of crisis, in this time of the climate crisis, Indigenous peoples represent a valuable resource in terms of traditional knowledge and what we have to offer and contribute to the very survival of the planet. And we have to begin to immediately publicly challenge and out the racist attitudes, the racist notions, the racist behavior of our friends and neighbors, institutions, and say very clearly, enough is enough. Stop this, this counterproductive, hurtful behavior that we've all been practicing for far too long. And I just want to acknowledge Louise Mandel, who for us is an icon, who was very much the part of birthing this organization and helping us organize to protect the Indigenous land rights, Indigenous human rights for at least the last 40 odd years. And we shall continue this struggle. Indigenous people are strong and resilient, and we love our grandchildren. As a grandfather, I know and understand that they're the center of our universe. And society needs to understand that there needs to be immediate transformation and transition and change. So I thank everyone here today for their commitment to bringing forward this new day, so to speak, in this country, where we move beyond this, this asinine frontier notion that has no place in today's society. That we need to come together as we need to reclaim our humanity collectively. So I want to thank everyone today for the good work that has brought us here together. White Limlin.